When it comes to roguelike video game experiences, I can't say that I've had very many at this point. Most of my time with the genre comes from the hours that I've sunken into Dragon Crystal for the Sega Master System, but despite my best efforts, I've never come close to finishing it. Even though I really enjoy the challenge and have been interested in trying others like it, I'm always a bit intimidated by the idea of having to start from scratch after every game over. Like Dragon Crystal, most roguelikes have permadeath as a feature. Azure Dreams is an adventure for the Game Boy Color that has many features of roguelikes, but no permadeath and lots of other bells and whistles to push it more towards the category of roguelite instead. You play as a young boy just turning 15 that aspires to be a monster handler. Coming of age permits him access to a looming tower that overflows with monsters of many types, and inside, monster handlers can find eggs to raise allies from or hunt all sorts of beasts to accumulate experience. For the protagonist, this new privilege also goes hand in hand with the bittersweet reality of his missing father's fate. Guy was one of the best of his trade, but disappeared after entering the tower many years prior. Many search parties were deployed to find him, but all of them failed. Part of becoming a monster tamer means finally being able to search for him and possibly gain some closure around his disappearance. When the game starts out, after being congratulated by your family for getting a little older, you can walk around your hometown of Monsbaya and speak to a bunch of people to flesh out more context and backstory. You'll quickly learn that you're not exactly that squeaky clean main character type from other adventures, and according to rumors, you're actually a bit of a troublemaker. Everyone around town either feels that you're a total wiener or a horrible person, but their opinions will start to shift as you prove your braveness by reaching new heights in the tower. This is one of many small ways that you can gauge your progress, but regardless of how expansive it feels, the town is actually a very small part of this journey. The tower is the main event, and every time you enter, save for a few exceptions, the layout of the floors and the items you find inside are different each time. The goal is to wander around until you find the elevator to the next floor, and repeat that until you either die or have enough sense to warp out. In the vein of true roguelite gameplay, you're always at the mercy of what the tower has in stock on that particular tour, though you can retain a few things between runs. There's a small storage space in your family home to stockpile stuff that you find, but you can't take most of it back into the tower from town. You're limited to 5 items lest you be shunned by the gate's repulsion forces, and that includes any monster fighters that you're bringing along. My strategy was to take some trusty equipment and a wind gem for a quick exit just in case. Most of the things that you find in the tower have no use outside of it other than to sell for money anyway, but if you die while questing, you lose everything except for your monster pals. All of those cool bags of sand, orbs, and weapons must fall out of your pockets as you're dragged back to the safety of your bed. I'm not someone who likes to part ways with my inventory items unless I know that I won't need them later, but Azure Dreams forced my hand with its use it or lose it attitude. Being pushed to actually use things rather than risk losing them by death was beneficial, and I was able to lavish my monster friends with stat bonuses and buffs. Knowing that I could take advantage of what I had available in the moment versus the uncertainty of waiting until after the final boss fight like I usually do was a nice change. I really appreciated that even though you never knew what you'd find whenever you'd enter the tower, there was no item discovery mechanic where you'd have to use something or discard it to first reveal its function. This is extremely forgiving compared to other games, especially since you even get a handy item description that identifies them after you pick them up. There are a ton of things to find, from health and MP restoratives to magical objects to weapons and equipment. Inventory management is a huge part of this endeavor, but once you get a feel for how you like to play, you can begin prioritizing which items to haul along and what to leave behind. I'll say that shuffling inventory around was kind of annoying and unfortunately something that needed to be done often. The tiny space fills up very quickly, and if you want to drop something to make room for a better find, you have to go through way too many dialogue boxes to get the job done. While it is nice to not potentially lose something important with accidental hasty menuing, I wish this could have somehow been streamlined to make it smoother somehow. Lots of the menus in this are really clumsy and long to work through. Even talking to your mom to save your game feels like it takes an eternity, but at least you get to stare at her big face while you do it, I guess. While many of the items are thoroughly named and described, the weapons and armor are more or less a mystery. As far as I could find, there was no point of reference for whether or not the stuff that you found was better or worse than what you already had equipped. Putting on a new sword or shield might reveal its stats relative to a weapon of the same type, but there was no way to tell if an Iron Song was stronger than a Damascus, for example. When you equip a sword, your base stats don't change like they would in other games. To complicate things further, you don't really have a reliable baseline to compare your combat damage with. You're constantly being leveled up or even down if you run into the wrong enemy with mean-spirited magic. So how much you're hitting an enemy for is all over the place. There was nothing included in the manual to clarify any details with this, but it was a small problem in what was otherwise an interesting battle system. I'll get to that shortly. You may be wondering what all of the money that you'll get from selling excess inventories for, and there are a few things to do with it. The most obvious idea would be to take advantage of all the shops in town, but seeing that you're prohibited from bringing much into the tower makes this option useless unless you're really desperate. If I'd lost all my equipment after dying and had nothing at home in storage, I might have considered this, but most of the time I went into the dungeon hoping to find better equipment rather than relying on these places. There are two other main ways to spend, with the first being the carpenter shop. There are a couple of upgrades that you can buy for your family home that increase its size but also impact your stable bed and home storage capacities. I'd hoped that these improvements would also expand how much inventory I could carry around, but unfortunately that never happened. The other big cash drop is the Mons Baya Beautification Fund that your best friend Nico is fundraising for. She'll lock her giant gaze with yours while going on about how unappealing your hometown is every time you talk to her, so after I finished the house stuff, I dumped the rest of my cash in with her. I'm not really sure how much city building there is to be had here, since by the time I was finished with the game, I hadn't donated enough to see much of an effect. On the topic of NPCs, there are quite a few that you'll meet in your adventures in town, but also as you travel through the tower. You'll talk to people who knew your father or a couple of rival townsfolk that are also beginning their work as monster teamers. These encounters fill in the blanks about your dad's reputation and his role in your community, and if these people are your allies, sometimes they'll even give you free stuff. These handouts aren't just one-time occurrences either, but as nice as getting a few extras to add to your inventory might be, the dialogue never really changes and grew tiresome after a while. To put it very lightly, the localization was definitely lacking. Sometimes you'd have dialogue options that didn't really make sense in the context of the conversation, but I was mostly able to follow along. My favorite part was people referring to the main character's father as the dad of Hun. It didn't matter how many times I heard it, it made me laugh every time. The unintentional humor in conversation was paired nicely with some awesome character art as well. It's rare to see this degree of complexity in character portrayals, and despite being caught off guard by how intense some people's stares could be, that extra visual effort made this experience feel unique from other Game Boy Color games that I've played. Even with all of these interactions, I found the story to be very sparse. That's not to say that the narrative is lacking in passionate moments, because there is some of that, but it doesn't happen until the game's virtually over. It wasn't enough to really grab me personally, but if you're into story and character development, the PlayStation version apparently focuses a lot more on that sort of thing. There's a lot more to do in terms of town building and even a full-fledged dating sim aspect to explore, but I haven't played it myself to comment on it further than that. Back to the Game Boy Color version now, the main goal of all of this tower exploration is not to level up your main character, since he always returns to level 1 when you leave the tower. Instead, as you find and collect monster eggs to hatch and raise, they're the ones that can retain their experience as they journey along with you. Your familiars will mainly level up from battle, but you can hasten their progress with a handful of items that you'll come across. To bring a new party member on board, you'll have to acquire eggs and hatch them in your nursery at home. You'll find them while meandering, or you can use items to force a desired monster type that you encounter back into egg form. Yeah, it's a little weird and questionably ethical, but it works. You're quite limited on space in both your inventory and monster stable, so unfortunately you can't have an endless supply of companions. This is by no means a catch-em-all situation, but there's still a lot of fun to be had in bringing eggs home and seeing what busts out of them. And if you're not able to hunt down everything that interests you on your own, there's link cable capability to trade with other people, just like other monster-based games from this era. Because of the enormous roster of monsters available to find and catch, the amount of replay value here is tremendous. You can spend hours working through the tower floors with new monsters to strengthen them, and you can have the freedom to pick and choose the kinds of elemental properties or attributes that you enjoy the most in your fighters. As they level up, they'll become stronger, but as far as I understand, they won't learn new moves or skills this way. In order to get more desirable traits for your favorites, you can perform some questionable science and fuse them with other monsters to make new and improved versions. This may become important to you since you're restricted to a maximum of 2 active familiars of your choice while exploring, but there is some trial and error to forming the partners that you want. Some great stats like enormous defense or speed will be immediately apparent to you just through observing encounters with monsters that have those features, but other less visible ones will take some sleuthing to reveal. In my experience, if I got flattened by a monster, I wanted it in my stable either to add to my own party or to try to fuse with one of my companions. But truth be told, I didn't spend much time on this mechanic. If monster raising and experimenting are things that you really enjoy in your gameplay though, there's plenty here to keep you occupied for a long while. When it comes to combat, there's a lot here. Your familiars can be set up in different battle configurations, you can alter their aggression levels, set preferences for whether they use magic or do physical attacks, and much more. For a game with such a simple premise, this degree of customization felt at times like it was a little overkill. The manual's really helpful in explaining the basics, and you get a very lengthy tutorial at the beginning of the game to lay it all out, but putting it into practice was a bit much for how casual the rest of this game feels. Either way, I personally stayed away from settings that used up a lot of MP because if your battle partners run out of it, they stop moving and go out of commission until you exit the tower again. This can be really dangerous if you're deep into your travels because the human protagonist is way less effective on his own than he is as part of a team. If he wipes, your whole party wipes. Thankfully, there are plenty of pickups that refill MP, but it's still daunting to know that more or less every step or action taken drains a little bit away from them anyway. No amount of planning can save you from trouble if you push your party's limits too far. Fights with enemies begin whenever you or your familiars come nose to nose with them. Everything only moves when you do, but if you play your cards right, you can coordinate your comrades into a position to fight on your behalf or carefully avoid encounters you'd rather not engage in. Most of the time, you view the battles from a distance overhead, but once in a while, you're treated to a close-up of your party members and their foes crossing swords, which was one of the most charming aspects of this game for me. The enemy types were beautiful as well as diverse, ranging from adorable round cuties to some toothier uglies. Their attack styles and skills were just as varied, creating some great suspense whenever you'd come up against something new. Being aggressively pursued by monsters that wanted me dead and wondering if I'd have enough strength or strategy to survive them all was what I found the most engaging. It was fulfilling to push through those difficulty spikes and climb into the elevator only to arrive at something even more heinous to overcome. I became hooked on the ideas of what-ifs, contemplating the risks of losing it all through death or squeezing out of the tower alive with a few new weapons or eggs if I could find them in time. While there isn't a ton of variety in the big picture, it's the turning point in each run where things go from comfortable to uncomfortable that really make this and many other games like it compelling enough to keep playing. While they aren't frequent, there are a few boss fights to wade through, and they're hard. I don't want to give away too much, but they firmly put the brakes on my progress until I figured out a means forward, but even when I won, I just squeaked by. One thing that got me through was actually the generosity of saving in Azure Dreams. Every time you take an elevator up to a new floor, you can record your progress, and there are multiple save slots to take advantage of. For me, being able to reset and reload was essential to figuring out how these evil ones ticked, but I only ever really leaned on the reset button in these boss scenarios because I didn't want to lose my best weapons and armor to trial and error. During regular exploration, I took my lumps in the consequences of dying if I wasn't quick enough to get away in time, but being able to use wind gems and warp out of the tower can be done at any time, even with your last sliver of health with nowhere to go but 6 feet under. That was also a fantastic option if you needed a break or just wanted to level up and regroup. But for the boss fights, I didn't want to wait 20 minutes walking back there to take another swing only to be sent right back down again. Even though I knew what I was signing up for before I started, the repetitive nature of this game did start to wear out the fun factor after a while. You could get through the early floors a little faster as your familiars leveled up, but those small advantages never fully counteracted the tedium of fighting wump after wump time and time again for the first couple of levels. The music also worked against keeping things feeling fresh for too long. It's not bad by any means, and in fact, the opposite is true. It's all quite catchy. The problem is that it only switches up every 10 floors, and you spend a lot of time in the first part of the dungeon. By the millionth trip in, I was really sick of hearing that same song, as good as it might have been. You can never really look forward to shortcuts to speed up your progress either, so you'll hear that wonderful tune over and over again until you don't have to anymore. When will that happen? Well, there's technically an ending to this game, but I'll put a little asterisk beside that. I don't want to reveal too much here, but let's just say that if you put in the work to reach the tower top, it's really only just the beginning. Azure Dreams is a very interesting take on the roguelike formula with a lot of replay value, especially for anyone that revels in monster hunting and experimenting. With virtually endless combinations of friends to find and fuse, there's no shortage of excitement here, but sadly the storytelling is comparatively shallow despite some good foundation work. This might be an adventure I'd return to as something to whittle away at a couple of times a week, but for me, the repetitiveness makes it too tedious to play for long lengths of time too often. That said, Azure Dreams is an above-average game that really should be enjoyed no matter how you decide to approach the challenge.